breaking point. I remember that day with stunning clarity, the day I almost gave up. It wasn't one of those dramatic earth-shattering moments with storm clouds and thunder. No, it was quieter than that. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary, nondescript. A day like any other, except that I woke up and everything in me felt heavy. Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally. It was the kind of heaviness that seeps into your bones and makes getting out of bed feel like climbing Everest. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, wondering how much longer I could pretend everything was fine. You see, for a long time, I wore my faith like armor, shiny, polished, always in place. I knew how to say all the right things. God is good, even when I was hurting. I'm blessed, even when I felt cursed. I went to church, raised my hands in worship, nodded at sermons, and smiled through gritted teeth. But behind the curtain, my soul was unraveling. The prayers I once whispered with fire now came out as sighs. The Bible that once felt alive in my hands now felt like just another book. And worst of all, I felt alone. So alone. That Tuesday, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink. My journal lay open in front of me, a pen resting on the blank page like it too had run out of hope. I tried to pray, but nothing came. No words, just silence. It wasn't just that I couldn't find God. It was that I wasn't even sure I wanted to. What was the point? I had tried. I had obeyed, I had served, and still I found myself in this place of despair. My finances were falling apart. Relationships I'd leaned on for support had crumbled. My dreams felt more like burdens than blessings. And in that moment, the lie that had been whispering in the back of my mind for months shouted loud and clear, "You're done. God's done with you." And I believed it. I pushed the journal away and let my head fall into my hands. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered to the silence. "If you're still here, God, I don't see you. I don't feel you. I'm tired of pretending." I didn't expect an answer. I didn't expect a miracle. In truth, I didn't expect anything at all. But that's the thing about grace. It doesn't wait for your expectations. It doesn't require your strength. It just shows up. As I sat there, the weight of hopelessness pressing in, something unexpected happened. A memory. Out of nowhere, my mind drifted back to a moment in childhood. Me, sitting cross-legged at vacation Bible school, eyes wide as the teacher told us about the lost sheep. "Jesus leaves the 99 to go after the one," she said, "because even when you wander, you're still his." Tears came then, uninvited, uncontrollable. Not because my circumstances had changed, not because I suddenly felt better, but because somewhere deep in my soul, that little girl's faith, the one who believed Jesus would always come, broke through the adult cynicism and whispered, "You're still the one he's after." I didn't hear an audible voice. There were no angelic choirs, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Presence, not a fix, not a solution, just presence. And that presence did something profound. It reminded me I wasn't alone. That even in my mess, even in my questioning, even in my almost giving up, God was there. I picked up the pen, not because I had something beautiful to write, but because I needed to mark the moment. "Still here," I scribbled, "still holding on." That became the beginning of my testimony, not the moment of victory, but the moment of surrender. The moment I stopped performing and started being honest. The moment I realized God wasn't asking for my strength, He was offering His. The days that followed were magical. I didn't wake up the next morning full of faith and fire, but I woke up and I wrote. Every morning, I sat at that kitchen table and wrote something, anything. Sometimes it was scripture, sometimes it was questions, sometimes it was just tears on paper. But I kept showing up, and every day, so did God. Grace doesn't always come like a flood. Sometimes it comes like a drip. Steady, consistent, softening the hard places, healing the cracks. Friends began to check in. Out of the blue, someone from church dropped off groceries. Another friend sent a worship playlist. Just felt like you might need this, she said. I listened, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't turn it off. One song wrecked me. God of the mountains, God of the valleys. I sobbed, because I had only ever celebrated the God of the mountains. But here in the valley, I was starting to believe he was still good, still kind, still pursuing me. A pastor once said, "The devil doesn't just want to destroy your future, he wants to rewrite your story so that you forget grace ever showed up." I had let shame narrate my life for too long, but that morning, in the quiet of my kitchen, I made a decision. I would no longer let my pain be the loudest voice. Grace had a say, and I was going to listen. There's something powerful about deciding not to give up, even when nothing looks different. That kind of faith doesn't come from you. It comes from the Spirit who groans within you when words run out. It comes from the Savior who weeps at gravesides and whispers, "Come forth." That was the day I almost gave up, and that was the day grace found me. The first step forward. The day after grace found me, nothing looked different on the outside. My bank account was still in the red. My phone still didn't ring with reconciliation. The mirror still reflected a woman with tired eyes and puffy cheeks. But inside, a whisper had been planted, and it refused to die. That whisper didn't come with thunder, it came with stillness. It didn't speak promises of immediate breakthrough, it simply said, "Keep going." I had no master plan, no 10-step program to pull myself out of the pit. All I had was a shaky faith and a decision to trust the whisper more than the weight. And so I chose something small. I opened my Bible, not because I felt spiritual, but because I needed to see if the word could still speak. I landed in the book of Psalms. David's words didn't feel distant or poetic. They felt raw, real, like he had read my journal before he wrote his own. "Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God." I clung to that verse like it was a lifeline. Putting hope in God didn't mean I stopped feeling broken. It meant I chose to believe he was still the God of broken people, that he could take my pieces and start forming something again. That morning I read 2 chapters, the next day I read 3, then 4. Sometimes I wept over the pages. Sometimes I just stared at the words, numb. But I kept coming back. Something shifted when I let go of needing the perfect prayer or the perfect emotion to approach God. I started showing up messy, confused, even angry. And each time I felt him meet me there, not to scold me, not to fix me immediately, just to be with me. I started to believe the truth I had told others for years but had struggled to grasp for myself, that God is not afraid of my mess. He is not threatened by my doubt. He is not put off by my pain. He enters it. That's when the steps began, tiny ones, unsteady. I started going for short walks just to breathe. I turned off the noise of social media and let silence speak. I reached out to a counselor, something I had avoided out of pride and fear. She listened. She didn't try to fix me either. But she reminded me that healing takes time, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep waking up. One of the biggest turning points came during a Sunday morning service I almost didn't attend. I stood in the back, arms crossed, heart guarded. The worship team started singing a song I hadn't heard in years. Come as you are. And it broke me. Right there in the back row, I dropped to my knees and wept. Not because everything was better, but because I finally believed I didn't have to be better to be welcome. That day, I talked to a pastor. Not with polished language or a neat testimony, just honesty. I told him I felt like a fraud, that I was hanging by a thread. He looked me in the eye and said, "That thread? That's called grace, and it's stronger than you think." That conversation was a catalyst. It didn't solve everything, but it started something. I joined a small group, not because I was ready to lead or teach, but because I needed community. I sat in circles with people who didn't have all the answers but had decided not to quit. We shared stories, tears, prayers, and little by little, hope started to grow roots again. I began to write more, honestly, vulnerably, not for likes or validation, but to process, and eventually, to testify. I started to see that testimony isn't about having a perfect ending. It's about telling the truth in the middle. I wasn't fully healed, but I was healing. I wasn't completely restored, but I was being rebuilt. Each step, though small, felt sacred. Making coffee and whispering thank you before the day began. Texting someone back when I wanted to isolate. Praying even when it felt like talking to the ceiling. Singing even when my voice cracked with doubt. These were my first steps forward. They didn't always feel spiritual. Sometimes they felt awkward, forced, but I kept going, and grace kept meeting me. I started seeing evidence, not in the big miracles, but in the little mercies. A bill paid unexpectedly, a friend's hug at just the right moment, a sunset that made me breathe deeper, a sermon that felt like it had been written for me. These moments didn't change my situation, but they changed me. Faith wasn't a finish line, it was a journey, and I was finally walking it, not sprinting ahead or dragging behind, just walking. With God, one step at a time when healing gets messy. Healing is never a straight line. I learned that the hard way. There's a misconception that once you decide to follow God again, once you surrender and let grace in, everything should start clicking into place. Your emotions should align, your mind should clear, your circumstances should shift. But that's not always how it goes. Sometimes healing gets messier before it gets beautiful. And for me, that mess showed up quickly. It started subtly. A wave of sadness I thought I had overcome resurfaced. One morning, as I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair, tears slipped down without warning. There was no specific trigger, no dramatic event, just a sense of weight pressing against my chest again. I was embarrassed. Hadn't I already moved on? Hadn't I already decided to trust God, to walk forward? Why was the heaviness back? That's the thing about brokenness. It doesn't disappear just because you've named it. It lingers. It asks to be tended to again and again, like a wound that needs daily cleaning. And I was beginning to see that faith wasn't just about trusting God on the good days. It was about trusting Him when everything still felt raw. One night, about a month into this journey, I found myself angry. Not just frustrated, angry. I wanted to scream at God, and so I did. I sat in my car, parked at the edge of a grocery store lot, fists clenched on the steering wheel, and let it all out. Why did you let it get this bad? Why didn't you stop it sooner? Why does it still hurt? And in the stillness after my outburst, I expected silence, or worse, condemnation. But instead I felt a whisper. I'm still here. That whisper didn't fix everything, but it softened me. It reminded me that God isn't just present in my praises, He's present in my protests too. Healing, I realized, was less about becoming someone new and more about being fully honest with the one who already knows me. So I stopped editing my prayers. I stopped cleaning them up before presenting them to God. I started bringing the mess, the shame, the doubts, the guilt, the confusion, and slowly, those conversations with God became more real, more intimate. Like a father sitting with his child, not demanding perfection, just offering presence. That authenticity spilled into my community too. I began to open up more in my small group. Not just sharing victories, but confessions. I had a panic attack this week. I didn't want to pray. I felt jealous of someone else's joy. And instead of judgment, I was met with nods. With me too. With shared tears and honest prayers. We stopped pretending church was a place for the perfect. We let it become a place for the broken healing together. One of the women in the group, an older mentor figure named Linda, said something that stuck with me. The mess is often where the miracle begins. She shared how her own healing journey took years, not weeks. And how even now, decades later, she sometimes revisits pain with new understanding. God doesn't waste anything, she said. Not even the parts we want to erase. That truth helped me breathe easier. I started to see my setbacks not as failures, but as invitations to return, to rest, to rely on grace. I stopped expecting linear progress. I gave myself permission to be in process. During that season, I also wrestled with identity. If I wasn't the person I used to be, and I wasn't yet who I wanted to become, then who was I? That liminal space was terrifying. But Scripture began to redefine me. You are a new creation, 2 Corinthians reminded me. He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion, Philippians echoed. Those words became my anchors. And God, in His kindness, began to send confirmations, not in fireworks, but in fingerprints. A child's laughter reminding me of joy. A verse I'd read 100 times landing differently. A friend sending a message at the exact moment I needed encouragement. Grace showed up, again and again, not with grand gestures, but with gentle reminders. I'm still working in you. Eventually, I reached a point where I could look back and see progress. Not perfection, but progress. I no longer cried every morning. I started dreaming again, tentatively but sincerely. I found myself praying for others, not just myself. I caught glimpses of the person God was forming in the fire. But I also knew the journey wasn't over. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a daily dependence, and I was learning, more than ever, to walk by faith and not by feelings. What grace builds in the ruins. By the time I reached what I now call the rebuilding season, everything around me still looked the same, but inside, a quiet revolution had begun. The ruins of my life, what once felt like broken fragments of dreams, relationships, and hope, started to shift beneath the surface. Not into a complete restoration just yet, but into a foundation. Grace was building something new, something holy, right in the middle of what I thought was lost. It started with perspective. Before I used to pray for the pain to go away, but something changed. I began to pray differently. I stopped asking God to remove the storm and started asking Him to reveal Himself in it. That shift, though subtle, altered everything. I wasn't fighting the fire anymore. I was learning to walk through it, hand in hand with the one who is fireproof. In the ruins, I discovered the blueprint of grace. It didn't promise comfort. It didn't guarantee that I'd get everything back the way it was. But it whispered a promise. I'm doing something new. Like Isaiah 43:19 declares, "See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Those words felt like they were etched into the very air I breathed. I began to see glimpses of what God was rebuilding. My faith, first and foremost. It wasn't built on emotional highs or conference sermons anymore. It was anchored in quiet moments. Early morning stillness with an open Bible. Long walks where I poured out my soul. Tears that watered the soil of new trust. I realized that faith built in the ruins is stronger because it has been tested. God also rebuilt my understanding of purpose. I used to think purpose was about performance, doing big things, achieving visible results. But in the ruins, I saw that purpose is obedience. It's showing up. It's loving well. It's trusting when it doesn't make sense. That's where God met me most. One evening, while journaling, I wrote down something that felt like revelation. Ministry doesn't start when you're healed. It starts when you're honest. That became a theme for me. I began to share my story, not the polished version, but the in-process one. I spoke to others who were in their own messes, not as someone who had it all figured out, but as someone who understood. And somehow, my vulnerability became a bridge for healing. One young woman I met at church came up to me after I shared a short testimony. Her eyes were red from crying, and she simply said, "Thank you for being real. I thought I was the only one." That moment reminded me why God lets us walk through hard things, not just for our growth, but for others' freedom. Our testimony isn't just about us. It's about showing others that God is still good, even when life is not. Community became even more essential in this rebuilding. I stopped trying to be impressive. I started being present. I sat with people who didn't need me to have the answers, but just needed someone to sit in the ashes with them. We prayed together, we laughed, we cried, we waited on God, and in that waiting, grace kept building. God started rebuilding my joy. Not the loud, boisterous kind that demands a stage, but the quiet joy that sneaks up in moments of gratitude. A sunrise, a kind word, a warm cup of coffee after a restless night. I began to see joy as a rebellion against despair. Every time I chose to rejoice, I was declaring that God was still worthy, even if I was still waiting. God also started restoring relationships. Not all of them, but some. The ones He breathed life back into were the ones that could bear the weight of truth. Conversations became more honest. Apologies were exchanged. Grace flowed. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it redeemed it. Most importantly, God began to rebuild my identity, not as a person defined by failure, but as His child, loved, chosen, enough. That identity wasn't shaken by my past, it was sealed by His grace. And as I leaned into that truth, I stood taller, not because I was stronger, but because I was finally standing on the rock. Looking back, I now understand that God often builds best in the rubble. Because in the ruins, there's room. Room for Him to move. Room for Him to shape us without the clutter of pride or self-sufficiency. I was empty enough to be filled, broken enough to be made whole, and slowly what once felt like the end of my story became the birthplace of something eternal. Grace doesn't just rescue, it rebuilds, and what it builds is stronger, purer, and more beautiful than anything we could have built on our own. Living the story you didn't choose. No one signs up for the valley. No one wakes up and says, "I hope today breaks me." We dream of mountaintops, not wilderness. But what happens when the life you imagined is not the life you're living? What happens when God's grace shows up not to rewrite the story you wanted, but to redeem the one you didn't choose? That's where I found myself, living a life I didn't plan, in a story I didn't ask for, and yet somehow I was beginning to see the fingerprints of grace all over it. There's a quiet kind of courage in learning to live fully in the life that is, not just the one you hoped for. For a long time, I was stuck in what ifs. What if I had made a different decision? What if I hadn't trusted the wrong people? What if I had been stronger? The past became a weight I carried into every room, and regret, though subtle, shaped the lens through which I viewed everything. But God, in His patient mercy, doesn't just forgive our past, He reframes it. He began showing me that redemption doesn't mean denial. It means that even the painful chapters can become part of the testimony. I didn't have to hide my scars anymore. In fact, they became the evidence of healing. I began to speak from a place of honest ownership. I stopped pretending that faith erased all my problems. Instead, I started sharing that faith gave me someone to walk through them with. I didn't have all the answers. I still don't. But I had a growing peace that surpassed understanding. And that peace became a testimony in itself. Living the story I didn't choose meant trusting that God was still writing something beautiful. It meant surrendering the pen over and over again, especially on the days when I wanted to take it back. It meant getting up on days I wanted to stay down, loving people when it felt safer to withdraw, serving when I felt empty, believing that even if I couldn't see the whole picture, the artist knew exactly what he was doing. One thing that helped was keeping a gratitude journal, not just a count your blessings habit, but a discipline. I began each morning listing 3 things. One thing I didn't want to face, one thing I was thankful for, and one thing I was trusting God with. It sounds simple, but over time, it reshaped my soul. Gratitude didn't remove the pain, but it made room for joy. And joy is a rebel in a world that expects you to crumble. There were still hard days. There still are. But I stopped expecting perfect peace to mean an absence of conflict. Peace, I learned, is the presence of Christ in the chaos. And in that presence, I found rest. One particular day, I walked past a mirror and almost didn't recognize the person staring back. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. I saw someone resilient, someone who had been through fire and didn't smell like smoke, someone who knew what it was to be held together by grace. I'm not the hero of this story, I never was. The hero is Jesus, the one who stayed when I wandered, who healed what I thought was beyond repair, who turned my mess into a message, who met me not after I had it all together, but right in the middle of my chaos. So if you're living a story you didn't choose, if you're staring at the broken pieces of what you thought life would be, I want you to know something. God is still writing, and His endings are never accidents. They're masterpieces shaped by mercy. Don't quit in the middle. Don't close the book yet. The same grace that found me is chasing you too. And what He builds in your ashes will one day be someone else's hope. He's not finished, and neither are you. If this story resonated with you, share it. Comment below with what part of this journey spoke to you most. Subscribe for more real stories of faith, grace, and redemption. And remember, God's grace is never late. It meets you right on time, even if the timeline looks nothing like you expected.